The NFL playoffs began this weekend, and unfortunately, the Jets were watching them from home. Today, we're going to talk about 3 things the Jets can learn from the teams that played this weekend on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, January 16th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. It helps the channel out. Helps other Jets fans find the podcast. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, the NFL playoffs got underway on Saturday. There were 2 games on Saturday, 3 games on Sunday. There's actually one final game tonight that will close out the wild card round between the Dallas Cowboys and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and then it's on to the divisional round. Unfortunately, the Jets were watching these games from home, and if you watched these games, some of them were entertaining. I was kind of surprised because I thought the overall caliber of play was kind of low, relatively speaking. There were some excellent games, but considering these are some of the best teams in the NFL, I was a bit surprised about how sloppy much of the play was. But, of course, the teams that won really don't care about that. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about the games this weekend, and not specifically what happened on the field, but what the Jets can learn from the teams that were participating in the playoffs. I'll give you 3 things I think the Jets can learn. And the first thing I think they can learn from Robert Saleh's former team, and that's the San Francisco 49ers, because they blew out the Seattle Seahawks, a game that was competitive at points in the second half, but the 49ers eventually pulled away. And, of course, one of the stories of the NFL season, especially the late part of the regular season and now the early part of the playoffs, is the play of Brock Purdy, who was Mr. Irrelevant, the final player drafted this year, actually the college quarterback of Jets star running back Breece Hall at Iowa State. And Purdy continues to impress. I think, though, you have to look at the context. And I don't want to take away anything from Brock Purdy, but do you really think that this guy was destined for superstardom, or do you think he's just put in a great situation and is making the most of it? And again, that's not to take away from Brock Purdy. I think sometimes we look for simple explanations when there are complex things happening. There's more than one thing happening. Brock Purdy's playing very well. He's also been put into a great situation. He's been put into a situation where he has great playmakers all across the board. When you're talking about Brandon Ayuk, or you're talking about George Kittle, or Deebo Samuel, or the guy the 49ers just traded for, Christian McCaffrey. I think one of the things, and he's also got a really good offensive line as well. I think one of the things that can be a mistake when you look at the offseason is too much focus is put on filling holes and taking positions that are bad and just making them okay. And that's an important part of team building. But I think sometimes, and this is true of fans, but it's also true of NFL teams, they lose track of the idea that you got to build units into overwhelming strengths. That's the best way to win in the NFL, is to not say, we got enough there. You want to keep building. You want to keep improving areas that are strengths. And I think the 49ers' ability to do so has helped sustain them even after losing their top 2 quarterbacks, and now going with this quarterback who, as well as he's playing, I think he probably went in the 7th round for a reason. Now, the 49ers deserve some credit because they saw some traits in him. They felt that he could run their offense effectively. But you drop Brock Purdy, and I'm not saying you drop him onto the Jets. You drop him into practically any situation other than the 49ers, I think it's going to be more of a struggle because you see moments where he looks like a rookie. But the 49ers have built an infrastructure that allows a young quarterback to sustain himself. And it's not so much about the quarter. It is about the quarterback to a degree, but I see people say, well, he's better than Zach Wilson. Listen, I've been very critical of Zach Wilson. You drop Zach Wilson into that San Francisco situation, I'm not sure it's going to be that bad. I mean, he may be playing as well as Brock Purdy because his mistakes, they can cover for them, and they can make life easier on him. I mean, Brock Purdy just drops a pass to a wide-open Deebo Samuel. He takes it 60 yards down the left sideline for a touchdown. Let's making life easy on your quarterback. Not to his credit, again, Purdy is doing things right, but he's also in a great situation. It's because the 49ers were not content with what they had. And you could even take it to the Christian McCaffrey trade, where they had playmakers left and right, but they added one more because they said, you know what, we can make our team better. It's not just because we're good doesn't mean it's good enough. Now, I actually have some mixed feelings on the McCaffrey trade in general. I don't know that I actually love the risk-reward proposition there because they essentially gave away their entire draft, what was remaining of their draft, because you have to remember they also traded a pick for Trey Lance for McCaffrey. And, 3 years down the line, this may not work out so well for them because it's really tough when you get nothing from a draft class, as we know very well as Jets fans. So I think it's one of those situations where it's worth it. If the 49ers win the Super Bowl and McCaffrey's a big part of it, it's worth it. But it's a pretty high-risk move, and maybe not one that's really playing the percentages all that well. But the mindset behind it, I think, is really good, where they're saying, you know what, maybe we have a lot of playmakers, but we can improve our team. Last year, a good example, it was the Jets, the way they approached the draft, because, nobody says it now. But at the time of the draft, there were lots of complaints about the Jets drafting Sauce Gardner. We all pretend that didn't happen. Nobody's going to admit to it now. But at the time, the Jets had signed DJ Reed in the offseason. They had a couple other young guys. Bryce Hall, as nightmarish as his 2022 season was, it's very easy to forget that Bryce Hall had a pretty solid 2021. Even if he was not playing at an elite level, he was good enough where you kind of feel like, okay, you can live with that at the very least. He's a functional starting player in this league. But the Jets said, you know what, that's not good enough. We need to build our cornerback position into one of overwhelming strength. And that's part of why the Jets had such a defensive transformation this year. Of course, it's not the whole thing. Quinnen Williams making the leap this year was obviously a major contributor, but the Jets saying, you know what, it's not just about needs, because there were plenty of people who wanted the Jets to take an offensive lineman, and it's not necessarily that the Jets obviously could have used offensive line help this year, but the players the Jet people wanted, instead of Sauce Gardner, who were offensive line prospects, they really weren't as good. They really weren't they did not play as well as Sauce Gardner, and they would not have made the impact Sauce Gardner made. So I think that you have to approach this offseason. Look, of course you want to upgrade linebacker. Of course you want to upgrade safety. Of course, listen, we got to do something about this offensive line, and we certainly have to do something about the quarterback position. But you don't want to lose track of continuing to add to the things you do well and build units that can overpower the opposition, because what the Jets did at corner helped sustain an elite defense this season. And you look at the offensive side of the ball, it's very tempting to say we're okay at receiver because we got Garrett Wilson and a couple other guys who can fill in after him as complementary players. No. You want to keep adding. You want to add a second go-to guy at the receiver position, because if you added another top-notch receiver to Garrett Wilson, and then you got Breece coming back, Breece Hall, suddenly this offense takes on a different look, and it becomes much easier. And to the extent teams develop quarterbacks, I think one of the best ways to develop a quarterback is to put him in a position where his life is easy. Again, where his mistakes are things he can get away with, things that don't sink the team, and where he has guys supporting him and he can build confidence and continue to take steps forward. I think that the 49ers are a good template in that. I hate the idea that the Jets hired Robert Saleh and now suddenly you wave a magic wand and the Jets become the 49ers. It doesn't work that way. But there are aspects of team building that you can borrow from the successful organizations in this league. And I think what you saw from the San Francisco 49ers on Saturday is something that shows you how teams sometimes make mistakes and what the 49ers have done right. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue talking about things that we've learned, or things the Jets should have learned from the teams that were playing this weekend. We're going to talk about in-game strategy, because Doug Peterson of Jacksonville made a very subtle move. It's kind of flown under the radar, but it helped the Jaguars win the game. We'll discuss that as we continue on this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. Of course, the Jets season's over, and your regular fantasy season's also probably over, but you can still play daily fantasy. And let me tell you how PrizePicks works. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you against the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch. So it includes the NFL, but it also includes the NBA, the NHL, men's and women's college basketball, esports, tennis, MMA, boxing, and even somehow disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's just that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they are currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 using promo code PrizePicks. So if you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you another $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you another $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by BetterHelp Online Therapy. Unfortunately, we do not come with a user manual, so when it's not working for you, it's normal to feel stuck. Therapists are trained to help you figure out the cause of challenging emotions and learn productive coping skills, which makes therapy the closest thing to a guided tour of the complex engine called you. BetterHelp has connected over 3 million people with licensed therapists. It's convenient, secure, and accessible anywhere, 100% online. Therapy offers so many benefits. You can learn coping skills, you can learn self-empowerment, you can learn how to deal with trauma. Everybody deserves to feel at their best, and BetterHelp makes it easier to get started. As the world's largest therapy service, they have matched millions of people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. It's all the benefits of in-person therapy, plus it's more convenient, more accessible, and more affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist, and if things are not clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It could not be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Get unstuck with BetterHelp. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. Subscribe to the Locked On NFL podcast and get daily conversations on the biggest NFL stories, plus in-depth analysis on the biggest games with NFL key predictions every Friday, and Monday local insiders cover the weekend with game-to-game episodes. Locked On NFL, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about the NFL playoffs. Unfortunately, we are not talking about the New York Jets in the NFL playoffs. One day. We've been doing this podcast since 2016. I still have not been able to talk about a Jets playoff game. I still have not been able to talk about a Jets winning season. One day, we'll do this on the podcast. But instead, we're watching the other teams that are playing, and of course, some of them have joined the Jets this weekend as they've lost and been sent off into their offseason. One team that looked like it was heading to the offseason was the Jacksonville Jaguars this past Saturday night, but they overcame a 27-point deficit against the Los Angeles Chargers, a game that could have major implications on the future of the Chargers because now there are all these questions about Brandon Staley's future, whether Sean Payton's going to go there, which would not have existed if the Chargers had just held on to their huge lead in that game. But there were plenty of turning points. I think one of the key turning points, one of the things that kind of flew under the radar, came when Jacksonville scored a touchdown in the fourth quarter. And prior to the extra point, that touchdown cut the Chargers' lead to 4. And the Chargers were charged with a dead ball penalty. And essentially what that did was that gave the Jaguars the opportunity to move the ball to the 1-yard line and go for a 2-point conversion. And Trevor Lawrence snuck it. They ran a quarterback sneak. He kind of jumped over the line, and they got the 2-point conversion. And that cut the lead to 2, which was critical because if the Jaguars kick the extra point in that spot, they're down 3. And what happened? Well, the Jaguars were down 2, and they drove into field goal range in the final minute of the game, and they kicked a field goal to win it as time expired. And because they were down 2, the field goal won them the game. Where again, if they just kick the extra point in that situation, they're down 3. That kick sends the game to overtime. You got to give credit to Doug Peterson. But I'm going to point something out. Last year, it was not the exact same spot. It was in the first half of a game, but there was a playoff game, the Tennessee Titans against the Cincinnati Bengals, where Mike Vrabel did something similar, where there was a penalty after a touchdown, and the Titans got the ball at the 1-yard line, and they went for 2, and they missed. and it was a tight loss, but for the Titans, that point came back to hurt them, and Mike Vrabel got crushed. Everybody crushed Mike Vrabel because he cost them a point. I thought it was the right move at the time, and I still maintain it was the right move. But I think the NFL is a league where people are very reluctant to challenge the status quo, and part of that's the status quo. People are used to the status quo. So if you do things status quo in the NFL and you fail, nobody cares. If you try and innovate a little bit and you fail, you get called the biggest fool in the world. That's just the way it works, unfortunately. And some coaches are really afraid to try and change the status quo. And the coaches who tend to take more chances and be innovative, they tend to be the guys like the Bill Belichick's of the world, the Andy Reids, the John Harbaughs, and a guy like Doug Peterson, who's got a lot of credibility as a Super Bowl winning coach because they know they're not going to lose their job. They're not going to be called foolish. But one of the things that's kind of come into the NFL over the last, I think it's especially become more pronounced in the last decade, the role of analytics, where they tell you that sometimes the conventional wisdom is wrong. And the fact of the matter is that Jacksonville took a kind of a gutsy move, but it was the right move if you look at the numbers, because once that ball moves to the 1 yard line, they got a great shot at getting the 2-point conversion. And the 2-point conversion in that spot was huge because, again, that was the difference between a field goal tying the game and a field goal winning the game. That's the difference between overtime and moving on to the divisional round right then and there. If they had missed that, they would have been crushed. But again, it was the right move. If you play it out 100 times, Jacksonville's going to come out ahead more often than not by going for 2 in that spot. Try and tell anybody that if they miss, though. All anybody would be talking about is Doug Peterson going for that 2-point conversion. Meanwhile, now that they've won, it kind of flies under the radar. It's talking, and rightly so, about Trevor Lawrence, about any number of things the Jaguars did in that game. In fact, Peterson's getting praised for a play call he made rather than the decision to go for 2. And it shows you, the fact of the matter is that the Jaguars won that game in part because they listened to the numbers. They listened to the analytics. And I think that there's this misconception in football that analytics are useless because they aren't at the level they're at in baseball. In baseball, they really have kind of narrowed things down where you can have a good sense of like numerically a player's value or any situation. And they're not quite there at football. And part of that's because baseball started about 20 years earlier than 15 to 20 years earlier than football, really trying to nail down statistically the value of every action on the field. So football is running about a decade and a half to 2 decades behind baseball in research. Another factor is that it's just easier to isolate events on the baseball field because in baseball at any given time, really only one player is controlling the action. 1 or 2 players are controlling the action in baseball, whereas in football, you got 11 guys on each side. So it's difficult to isolate individual value. But the smart franchises in this league are the ones that are open to new ideas. And I think there's this idea that, you have to be some sort of mathematician with a PhD from Harvard to appreciate analytics in football. And I think that there's this perception that there are guys who, these guys have never played the game. They don't really understand what's going on. And of course, you have to use common sense. There comes a point where football sense does come into play. But look at the coaches who embrace analytics in this league. John Harbaugh is one of them. Peterson's one of them. Bill Belichick claims he doesn't use analytics, but he does. You look at the way the Patriots run, they do. These are not guys who who look things up on spreadsheets. These are football guys, but they're open to new ideas. They're open to concepts that they think can help their team, that can give their team an advantage. And they're open-minded enough to know that the status quo, just because NFL teams have been doing something for decades, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to conduct business. It doesn't necessarily mean it gives your team the best chance. And I think the teams that are smart, are always going to be open to new ideas, new ways of doing things. Because if you're doing that, if you're doing something different that works, and another team's more resistant to change, it gives you an advantage. So I think that Jacksonville. When I was watching that play out, I was hoping Jacksonville would get the 2-point conversion just because I thought it was the right move, and because I think the numbers show you that ultimately you win more. You come out ahead more often than not by going for 2 in that situation, and it's one of many examples of how Doug Peterson uses the numbers to his advantage. I think any team in the NFL would benefit from doing that. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this Monday episode. I'll give you one more thought I have from this weekend's games, and it's about how it's a players' league. Coaching matters in football probably more than any other sports, but I think sometimes maybe we overstate the role of coaching and the impact of coaching relative to the talent of players on the field. I'll tell you what I mean as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Well, your dream can come true, and this game's definitely for you if that's the case. You can manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. Maybe you will assemble a team that will not miss the playoffs 12 straight years like the Jets have. In this game, you are responsible for hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, making draft picks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of the season, and all of this comes in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline, play on the go, and as you want to, when you want to. And Locked On Jets listeners get a free 100% boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, that's all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On, one word in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. Again, that's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about the playoffs. Unfortunately, we are not talking about the Jets in the playoffs. The Jets had to watch 5 games this weekend and then one more game tonight from home because they missed the playoffs for a 12th straight season. Of course, when you're looking at the great franchises in the NFL, you can learn from them as you try and build a winner. And I have one more thing that I've came away thinking from this weekend, and that's the role of coaching. And it's always a balance because players matter and coaches matter. And I think coaching in the NFL and coaching in the sport of football matters more than it does in any other professional league or in any other sport. But I do think we sometimes overstate how important coaching is. And I especially thought that watching the game last night between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Baltimore Ravens, which Cincinnati won. And of course, Cincinnati was the AFC champion last year. They almost won the Super Bowl. They got a great shot at doing it again this year, although a challenging game coming up this weekend against the Buffalo Bills. But I could not help but think their coach, who almost won the Super Bowl last year, has them right in the mix this year, Zach Taylor. What things were like for him in the year 2019. I did a little research because I wanted to make sure my memory was correct, and my memory was correct. In 2019, Zach Taylor's first year, the Bengals were the worst team in the NFL. In fact, they did not get their first win until Thanksgiving weekend when they famously beat Adam Gase's Jets. That was the game Adam Gase game planned for. He left Thanksgiving dinner with his family, as the story goes. He left Thanksgiving dinner with his family early to game plan, and the Jets scored 6 points and lost to the winless Bengals. But Zach Taylor dealt with a lot of criticism, not only his first year, but his first 2 years before the Bengals took off a year ago. There was a famous Monday night, or maybe it wasn't super famous, but there was a Monday night game where Booger McFarland, who was at that point the analyst for Monday Night Football on ESPN, praised the job Zach Taylor was doing, and Booger McFarland began trending on Twitter because people could not believe that Zach Taylor was getting praised. I did a search of articles that were written about Zach Taylor in his first couple of seasons. One was an inside look at the Bengals' toxic culture when it talked about, and Zach Taylor played a pretty big role in that. There was Zach Taylor's disappointing coaching tenure with the Bengals is a symptom of a bigger problem. These were things that were written about Zach Taylor. Suddenly, once Zach Taylor has Joe Burrow, and Joe Burrow his second season, but Burrow got injured, suffered a serious injury in the season. Suddenly, when Zach Taylor had Joe Burrow playing really well, he's a coach that almost won the Super Bowl. And that's not to say every single coach is equal and that coaches don't matter, but ultimately it is a players' league. Bill Belichick, who's one of the great coaches of all time, just about 500 in his career when his quarterback's been somebody other than Tom Brady. And I'll give you another example from this weekend. Of course, Belichick, thank goodness, missed the playoffs this year, but let me give you some numbers here about a certain team and where they've ranked in scoring offense over the last few years. This team ranked 20th in scoring in 2017, 21st in 2018, 2nd in 2019, 21st in 2020, 3rd last year, and 6th this year. And that team's the San Francisco 49ers, and the years I gave you were Kyle Shanahan's tenure. So his first 2 years, the Niners were 20th in scoring and 21st in scoring. They did not really have the quarterback situation settled in those 2 years. The first year, they entered the year with nobody really. Then they made the trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. The second year, Garoppolo was supposed to be the starter, but he got injured early in that season, missed most of the year. Then once everybody was healthy in 2019, they ranked 2nd in scoring and went to the Super Bowl. 2020, they had a lot of injuries. They did not have a great team around them. They finished 21st in scoring. Then the last 2 years, 3rd and 6th. And I spent the first segment talking about how great their offense was, talent-wise. It's very, very easy to overestimate how important coaching is. And listen, I've talked extensively about how important coaching can be, but it's important. It's also important to remember that at the end of the day, the NFL is a players' league, and it's about finding the balance. If somebody's going to take this and misinterpret it to mean I'm saying coaching is irrelevant, it doesn't matter. Like, oh, coach, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that there is a lot more that goes into coaching than just the results. The results are not always just about the coach. And more often than not, it's a reflection of the talent level you have on your team. Because I give you Kyle Shanahan's statistics. Maybe the best offensive mind in the league. If not, he's one of the top 3 to 4 offensive minds in the league. Yet, for much of his tenure, his team ranked, in fact, half of his tenure, his team is ranked 20th or lower in scoring. And that's just because he didn't have the players he needed to run a system effectively. Now, Shanahan probably made it better than it would have been otherwise. You put a lesser offensive mind in there, maybe those 20 and 21st become 28th and 29th. But there's only so much a coach can do. And especially in this league, this is a league where talent dictates almost everything. So important to keep that in mind, because you think, not that long ago, 3 years ago, Zach Taylor was a laughingstock. Now he's a coach trying to go to the Super Bowl a second straight year. What's the difference? I'm sure Taylor's become a better coach in some ways. In some ways, maybe he wasn't ready to be a coach. I'm always better in year 4. I think, like everybody, almost all of us, we're better in any job year 4 than we were year 1. So I'm not saying Zach Taylor has not made improvements, but biggest improvement was the talent, I think, on that team. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.